I was going to cover the Nintendo Direct, but I might do something else. Instead, we're going to cover Sonic the Hedgehog. For the 1% who don't know him, he's a speedy blue hedgehog, and Sonic is owned by Nintendo. Oh, that's a good one. Wait, you're not joking, are you? No, I'm not joking. Nintendo owns Sonic the Hedgehog in this alternate timeline. Alternate timeline? You had me going there for a second. No, I just learned that Capcom owns Sonic the Hedgehog. Okay, this is starting to sound ridiculous. Capcom doesn't even own the Sonic IP, and they already have a similar character named Mega Man. Oh, so it's not owned by Capcom. I must have messed up the ownership again. It's obviously owned by Bandai Namco. Bandai Namco? Don't they already have enough franchises as it is? Why would they own Sonic the Hedgehog? They don't even own the IP. Whoops, I did it again. It's not owned by Bandai Namco. You're right. Thank you for being intelligent. Instead, it's owned by the Japanese government, which is where Sonic was from. The Japanese government? Okay, you've definitely lost the plot here. You're right, it's not owned by the Japanese government. I must have changed the script by accident to something nonsense. You're right. I just learned that it's owned by the United States government. So please pay your taxes before they start to capture you alive. Okay, I don't know what to say anymore. You clearly have lost the plot here. You're not even trying to be an accurate person. You're just trying to make content just to satisfy YouTube. Yes, I am. Now let's start over from the beginning now. And this time, please do it correctly. Or at least try to stay on script. Okay then, let's start from the beginning again. Sonic the Hedgehog was released in 1991, the same year that Pan Am went bankrupt. Again, who changed my script? The correct answer are the three most important individuals, Yuji Naka, Naoto Oshima, and Hirokazu Yasuhara, would go on to release it for the Genesis in North America and the Mega Drive everywhere else. With the series becoming popular in the early 90s, Sega wasted no time making 2 more sequels, an expansion pack, and several spin-offs for the Genesis and again the Mega Drive everywhere else. However, nothing lasts forever. Following the release of the Sega Saturn in 1994 in Japan and everywhere else in 1995, the series ended up being dormant until the release of Sonic Adventure in 1998 for the Dreamcast, skipping the Saturn entirely, which was a bummer because, well, Sonic Adventure was originally going to be released for the Sega Saturn. But by that point, it wouldn't have made any difference. So instead, what we're going to do is this. What if Sega released Sonic Adventure for the Sega Saturn, not in 1998, but instead in 1996? You may be thinking, wasn't there supposed to be a game that would come out in 1996? Yes, you are correct. It was called Sonic Extreme. Sonic Extreme was supposed to come out in 1996 as a Sega Saturn game. This would have been their premier Sonic game. However, instead we got Nights into Dreams, which was created by the 3 founders who had worked on Sonic the Hedgehog for the Mega Drive, or Genesis in North America. So the question now we have to address is, would the 3 founders of the series create a 3D Sonic game? Yes, believe it or not, but not officially at first. Instead, they would come up with a concept for the game and turn it into a full-length game once they had the idea down. However, because this was the early days of 3D gaming, it was very difficult. So instead, they decided to use what they had built and create Nights into Dreams instead, which was a great game on its own right, but it was never a Sonic game for it. And instead, the game that was supposed to come out for it was cancelled. So instead of releasing Nights into Dreams in 1996, the team would actually create Sonic Adventure. The team would create Sonic Adventure for the Sega Saturn in 1994 and would hire a lot of people to make this game come to life. This would mean that the game would have to compete with Super Mario 64 on the same year and would also compete with Crash Bandicoot. This would give the series a jump compared to, say, Super Mario 64, which was an open world. And while Sonic Adventure was an open world when it came out in 1998, here in 1996, that doesn't mean anything, and people would say that Sonic Adventure was the first to come out before Super Mario 64. Speaking of Super Mario 64, we also have to make sure this game comes out before that game would come out. In other words, Sonic Adventure has to come out first before Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot, which would mean, much like in our timeline, they would have to do a lot of crunching for this game in order to come out. Unlike the United States, Japanese people tend to work a lot longer, so it has a higher chance of being released to the public versus, say, in America. Not to say that this wouldn't have happened, but it's just that people would become very tired of making the game and would be burned out more of making any future installments for the time. Which is okay here because after they created Sonic Adventure for the Sega Saturn in 1996, they would create Nights into Dreams that was released in 1998 instead and would go on to become something different and fresh. But given that Sega of Japan didn't initially care for Sonic until its compilation came out in 1997 known as Sonic Jam. I've been discussing Sonic Adventure, but without explaining what genre this would be on. Well, obviously this is going to be a platformer, isn't it? Originally it wasn't supposed to be. Instead, this was going to be a role-playing game. You mean like Final Fantasy? Originally, yes, but not in the way you're thinking of. Because after Nights into Dreams was released in our timeline, the team wanted to create a story-driven game featuring Sonic. So they decided to create an RPG featuring Sonic named Sonic Adventure that was originally going to be released for the Sega Saturn. However, because the Saturn R timeline was a failure, and Sonic Extreme being cancelled, it was moved to the Dreamcast following afterwards, and it became a 3D platformer. But with this game now coming out in 1996, it becomes a lot harder to determine what kind of genre this game would be. Would it still be a story-driven game? Or would it even be a role-playing game at all, originally? If I had to take a guess, this would be a 3D platformer, much like Super Mario 64, as I mentioned earlier, but with one difference. The game came alongside with Super Mario 64 with a 3D control pad, but the Sega Saturn came with a traditional controller. But luckily in our timeline, and in this alternate timeline as well, Sega released a 3D analog stick that was originally released for Nights into Dreams. But instead of Nights, we get Sonic Adventure for it. Much like the Dreamcast, the controls would rather be, well, exactly like the Dreamcast, with the L and R buttons being for camera controls, and the analog stick being used to move Sonic around. I've been mentioning Sonic, but what about his friends? With the exception of Tails, Sonic's friends will be mostly on the background as NPCs. Sonic and Tails' signature moves would still appear in the game, but would be very different compared to what you would see on the Dreamcast. And on the Dreamcast, it had 4 action buttons, but the Sega Saturn 3D analog stick had 6, meaning that the developers would take advantage of the extra 2 buttons to give Sonic and Tails some unique moves that had never been done before. Now, the reception of this game in 1986 would be very different versus in 1998. Because in 1996, as I mentioned several times, Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot would still be out. This means the game would get a lot of attention. Would they like the game? Well, back then, people would be mesmerized by it, and it would be seen as a system seller for the Sega Saturn, meaning the Sega Saturn would start to see a sales increase after the release of Sonic Adventure for it, particularly in the United States and in Europe. As for Japan, well, that depends on what the people in that region would think. Because the Saturn was a success in Japan, this would mean that the Sega Saturn would have a chance of a success for a Sonic game there. Now, would that mean it would actually be the best seller? No, because Virtual Fighter would still be very popular to the Japanese market, and that Sega of Japan would still focus on that series rather than their flagship one at the time, Sonic. But later on, the series would become popular in Japan, even if it doesn't reach the same numbers as the West. So after the release of Sonic Adventure and Nights into Dreams on the Sega Saturn, along with Burning Rangers, however, much like in our timeline, we would still get spin-offs, or perhaps even more Sonic games on the Sega Saturn. First, we would get Sonic Fighters, which was an arcade game, followed by Sonic R, which was released in 1997 by Traveler's Tales, along with a Sonic Party game that would release in 1999 in this alternate timeline, developed by Hudson to take advantage of the 8-player functionality, and even the release of Sonic Extreme in 1999 after the success of Sonic Adventure 3 years prior, which would give Sonic fans 2 choices to pick which Sonic game they liked the most, the Japanese adventure game or the West's Extreme game. But wait! Sega's own studio in America was closed in 1996, so who would make this game then? Well, Sega of America would asked Sonic Team of Japan to form a studio in the West called Sonic Team USA. Now, whether or not this would happen, or what say they asked Real Time Associates to make the game instead. Either way, we would still get this game in this alternate timeline after the success of Sonic Adventure in 1996, even if this is an alternate scenario. There is one more thing we also need to address. What about the other games that didn't become successful for the Sega Saturn? Now, because of Sonic Adventure's success on the Sega Saturn, would we see more games for it? That's beyond the scale of the scope, but let's say they do have more games for the Sega Saturn. And, I forgot to mention this earlier, we would get Shenmue for the Sega Saturn instead of being released for the Dreamcast. And one other thing too, we would get more third-party games for the Sega Saturn. Even a port of Final Fantasy VII, which I covered in my YouTube channel, which is in the description below after this video. But unlike that one, this one would come out in the West, even after the release of the PlayStation version. Although that one is debatable whether if that was really going to happen. But who knows, maybe it would have, and Sony's strength in the console market would have been much smaller. However, the console would still outsell the Sega Saturn, even with the Sonic game coming out. Which means that the Sega Saturn would overtake the Nintendo 64 in this alternate timeline, even if the Nintendo 64 was much more successful in the West than it was in Japan. But then again, this is just one scenario. And as usual, thank you for watching the video and have a wonderful day. And until next time, bye.